We'll go ahead and get started. I'll ask if you'd like to read, to go ahead and unmute your microphone. We're a little shorter today on participants. I know I've heard from a couple of different ones, had some other things going on and weren't going to be able to join. And one of those is Kyle Sanders, and he was actually going to lead the study, the discussion today, but he was unable to do that. So we'll do the best we can. We're going to start our reading in Mark 10 and verse 32. Last week we read the story of Jesus and his encounter with the rich young ruler, and then the discussion with the disciples that followed afterward in verses 23 through 31. And we did not discuss in depth verses 23 through 31. So I'd like to just say a couple of things about that before we continue on reading in verse 32. One is, I was in a class years ago and someone made the comment about the picture that Jesus draws in verse 25 of it being easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And he went on to explain how Jesus wasn't talking about the literal eye of a needle, but a portion in the wall of the city. And at the time he was presenting it, it sounded pretty good. I thought, hey, that's neat. I never knew that. But then when you go on to look at what is said afterward in verses 26 and 27, the disciples' reaction was, who then can be saved? And Jesus then says, with men, it is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So to try to make verse 25 and the picture that's used there, be something that could be doable, because a physical camel couldn't actually go through the eye of a needle. I think that's exactly why Jesus uses that picture, because it is impossible for a man. For us, we couldn't put that camel through there. But if God desired to put a camel through the eye of a needle, he could do that. And, for the disciples, looking at what is said about Lazarus, here's a rich man who has kept the law, and they're looking at him thinking, well, if he can't enter, well, then who could? Well, Jesus has already shown really who can. And that was back earlier in the chapter when the little children were brought, and they tried to keep them from coming. And Jesus says that's who can be a part of this kingdom. And so I just think it's an interesting contrast between those little children whom the disciples didn't think much about, and then this rich young ruler who the disciples looked at and thought, well, if he can't enter the kingdom, I don't know who could. Well, Jesus is continually showing how the common thinking of the day was not right concerning the kingdom, who could participate in the kingdom, and just all kinds of things. And we're going to see more in our reading in this last part about some misunderstandings concerning the kingdom, and Jesus trying to set all of that straight. The last thing I'd note is in Mark here, we see in verse 28, Peter says, look, we've left all and followed you. And Jesus then goes on to talk about the blessings that will come as a result of leaving all to follow him. And in Matthew's account, he adds there that they would sit on 12 thrones. And I think that may be important to understanding something that we're going to see here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and pick up in verse 32, and we'll read down through verse 34. And Lisa, would you read that for us?
Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed. And as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. and they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him. And the third day he will rise again.
All right. So verse 32, where are they headed?
Up to Jerusalem.
Yeah, they're going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus has traveled to Jerusalem a lot during his work and his life. But there's something special about this journey to Jerusalem. And what's special about this particular trip to Jerusalem? You say that louder. Aaron's with me here.
It's going to be his last journey.
Yeah, it's going to be the last journey to Jerusalem. And Mark is very clear to point out that Jesus is before them and the disciples were following. And it also tells us the disciples were afraid. And I'd be curious to know if any of you have any thoughts concerning why the disciples would have been afraid. Is there anything else in any of the other gospel accounts to give us an idea of why they might be afraid as they go to Jerusalem? There's another story that is very close in time to this story. I think most would put it just prior to these events. It's hard to place it exactly. But in John chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. You remember the disciples' reaction when Jesus told them that he was going to go to Lazarus to be with him because he was sick, and then eventually, of course, he dies and he's going to go to raise him. But do you remember the disciples' reaction there in John 11 when Jesus says we're going to go? Ian's shaking his head yes. Ian, what did they think? You're gonna have to unmute yourself there.
Well, I'm not sure where you're at there in the narrative, but I just remember when Jesus said that Lazarus was asleep, that they were going to go to wake him up. His disciples said, "Well, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well." But then he said to them plainly that Lazarus was dead. So are you thinking about before or after he had made that statement?
Well, when you look on down and verse 16, what does Thomas say there? Well, I guess you back up in verse 8 when Jesus said, "Let us go to Judea again." What do they say in verse 8? This is in John 11.
Yes, sir. John 11:8, the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you're going there again?"
And then after he explains about why he's going and what's going on with Lazarus, what does Thomas say there in verse 16?
Thomas said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him."
And I just think and because as I was reading in Mark 10 there in verse 32, it stood out that the disciples were afraid. We've seen the disciples afraid when they were out in the water on the boat and they saw what they thought was a ghost coming toward them. They were afraid. When they were in the boat and the storm was coming, they were afraid. But generally, just walking down the road with Jesus, we haven't seen that fear. But I think what we see in John 11 helps us to understand why they're afraid as they're making this journey to Jerusalem. If anything, after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the attempts on the part of the Jewish leaders to kill him have intensified. And being associated with him, there would be a reason for that fear. And so Jesus, in verses 33 and 34, says that, what you had said back in John 11:8, they sought to kill you. Well, that's going to happen. Is this the first time he's told them that?
He's been bringing it up on several occasions. If you go back to Matthew's account, he's been telling them, but they don't, they have another concept of what the kingdom's going to be about, and they just don't want to accept that. Peter, he had to tell him to get behind me, Satan, because Peter said, not so, that's not going to happen to you. So they're not convinced that, he's going to die in a physical way, but he's pretty straightforward here.
That's right. In Mark 8:33 is where we find Jesus here telling Peter to get behind me, Satan, after having told them about his death. And then we see it again in Mark chapter 9 and verses 30 through 32. And verse 32 says they didn't understand. They were afraid to ask him. And now in all three occasions, Jesus says that the third day he's going to be raised. But this is the most complete description that Jesus has given. He speaks of the betrayal. He talks about who's going to be involved with it. It's going to start with the chief priests and the scribes, but he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. He speaks of the mocking, the scourging, being spat upon. So very, very descriptive in what's going to happen. And you can imagine as those, looking on at the events as they unfold, that their minds would go back to remembering what Jesus said here. And for me, as I was reading through this before we started the program, I was most struck by verse 35 and what follows because of where it is. Jesus has just told them about he's going to die. And so then we come to verse 35 and we have this scene, and I'm immediately thinking, what are they thinking? I know they've had problems with pride and wanting positions and things of that nature, but this just seems to be out of character, out of focus for what's going on. So let's read these verses, and then we'll come back and talk about maybe why they ask these things at this time. So we'll read 35 through 45, and we'll read a couple of verses apiece. I see Miss Chris is unmuted. So Miss Chris, if you would you start us off. We'll read 2 verses apiece. Chris, and then Aaron is here with me. He'll read 2 verses. Ian, Justin, if you're able to read, I see you're muted, but you're normally good to read. And then Nick, if you would read 2 verses apiece. We'll start with Miss Chris.
Is that starting with 35?
35, yes, ma'am.
James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?"
They said to him, "Grant us that we may sit on one of your right hand and one on your other on your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not ask what you ask.
You do not know.
You do not know what you ask. You are able to drink the cup.
Are you able?
Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?"
They said to him, "We are able." So Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink the cup that I drink, and with the baptism I am baptized with, you will be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared."
Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them.
Yet it shall not be so among you, but whosoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many."
All right, thank y'all. So Jesus just tells them in verses 33 and 34 what's going to happen, and very specifically what's going to happen. And then in verse 35, James and John come and say, Lord, we want you to do something for us. Give us whatever we ask. Well, what do you want? We want to sit on your right hand and your left hand. So what do y'all make of that? Why in that moment would, and I know we can't answer this exactly because we're not in their heads, but is there some way that we can look at this to see, well, maybe that's what is going on, right? Anybody have any ideas or thoughts about that?
They may be like, one idea can be like we are today. Sometimes we're not listening to what we're being told at the time, and we're thinking about, maybe our own perceptions of things, because as you read Acts 1, even after Jesus dies and is resurrected from the dead, they're still looking for an earthly kingdom at that time. They don't understand some of the statements that he's made, that his kingdom is not of this world, which is understandable. A lot of times when we have a perception in our mind, we're not focusing on what we're being told by someone. Maybe that could, I know that's conjecture as far as they're concerned, but that's what happens to me today. Sometimes I'm not listening to what I'm being asked or related to, and then I go and talk about something else.
And I think you're right. It is conjecture, but we can relate to that kind of thing. And I was talking with Tad Corder a little bit earlier about this, and he pointed out there in Matthew's account, just prior to this, Jesus had talked about them sitting on these 12 thrones. And you could almost just see James and John thinking about those 12 thrones and where are we going to be. And so as Jesus speaks there in verses 33 and 34, as you mentioned, they might not even be really paying attention to what he's saying because they're so focused on this other thing and what's going on, so that they come up to Jesus right after, not even paying attention and saying, well, we'd like to, when we're on those 12 thrones, how about we get to be on your left hand and your right hand? Matthew also adds, and I think it's worth bringing this up because there may be some reading this and they read Matthew and they might come away with the idea that, well, they're in conflict. They're disagreeing with what's being said here, because who does Matthew say was the one who came and asked the question initially?
Their mother.
Their mother.
Yeah, their mother. But it's obvious, and we're not going to go over to Matthew 20 and read that right now. But it's obvious in that discourse that as Jesus begins to address, he doesn't address the mother really. He turns his attention right to James and John. And so it's very possible that the three of them there, and they think, well, maybe he'll listen if you are the one who presents it. And so maybe she did ask that initial question. You say, well, why does Mark then say that James and John asked? Well, if James and John are the ones who put her up to it, then it's as if they asked. And so Mark wouldn't be incorrect to say that. And I only point that out because there are critics who want to seize on any possible discrepancy and say, well, see, you can't trust the Gospels because they can't even get this part straight. Well, I think it really does the opposite. I think it shows that the Gospels are true and original and inspired, because if it were a matter of making up a story, surely these men could have gotten together and got their story straight. And there's another issue that'll come up in just a minute with the healing of the blind man that would be kind of in that same vein. But back to their question, sitting on his right hand and left, how does Jesus follow that up? What does he ask them about? Because he doesn't initially just say no. I'm not going to do that for you.
He says you don't really understand what you're asking. There's a lot of things that Pharisees and others don't understand, and we see the disciples are sort of in the same boat. They're not comprehending a the setup that Jesus is in and him being subservient to his Father, doing his Father's will in all matters.
Yeah.
And it would, it might even suggest the idea that, whoever is put in those positions I'm not the one that's going to decide that. Someone else is going to, which, I'd immediately think of his Father,
Yes.
and he's going to be submissive to whatever that decision is. I don't know that's what it is, but something like
Yeah.
that.
That's what he goes on to say, just exactly that. But, their lack of understanding, they don't understand about his need to die. They don't understand about the nature of the kingdom, that it's not going to be this physical kingdom patterned after what they've seen before them with the world powers. And I think it's pretty obvious they don't understand, even in his question, are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? In other places, we'll see the disciples don't understand when he teaches them parables, and they'll ask him, what are you talking about? But here, I think we've been in a perfect place for them to say, what exactly are you talking about? But how do they answer that question?
We're able.
We're able. If, maybe they think that if they get verse 38 right, then that will secure their place. Yeah, we could do that. Whatever it takes, we can do it. If we can have this place of prominence. Of course, what they didn't know is that what Jesus is referring to is his suffering, his death, and they're going to follow suit by suffering with him. But it is interesting because they say we are able, and we might immediately think, well, they weren't able, because when Jesus is arrested and taken, they all forsook him. They all fled. But Jesus goes on to say there in verse 39, you will indeed drink the cup and be baptized with that baptism, which shows that Jesus knows they're going to get it. They are going to come to an understanding of what he's teaching, and they will be committed so that they will follow in his footsteps. And it's just, I think, very interesting. He's talking to James and John here. I think it would apply to all the disciples. But what do we know about James and John concerning the disciples after Jesus has been ascended to the Father, the church is established? What goes on with James and John? What do we know about them?
James will be the first one who is martyred of the apostles.
Yeah.
And John will continue on to grow in service to the Lord, and from what I understand, be the kind of the last one of the apostles standing, so to speak.
Yeah, I think secular history is pretty clear on that. But even as you look at the scriptures, I think it's pretty clear that John is the last. And you think about those two things. James obviously suffered that death, and he suffered in that way. But you look at the rest of John's life, who's better off after the death of James or John?
James has his reward once he is martyred, and then John is exiled to Patmos and deals with the sufferings of this world for some extended years.
Yeah, and I guess we can make the argument that both are better off because they're both serving the Lord in whatever capacity he has for them, but they're fulfilling what Jesus is saying here. You will do this, and they do. And I think that's a question that we all need to ask ourselves, the question that Jesus asked them. Are you willing? Are we willing to endure those sufferings? And hopefully we can answer it the same as Jesus answered for them. You will indeed do those things. And then, as Nick pointed out in verse 40, it's not Jesus's decision about who's going to be in what position in the kingdom, but he goes on to say, there's something you need to understand. This kingdom, my kingdom, it's not going to be like the kingdoms of the world. And so you've got those of the Gentiles who lord it over them. But it's not going to be that way among you all. And he uses himself as the ultimate example of one who really had the authority and the position if he chose to exercise it. But what does he say about himself in verse 45?
Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many.
There you go. It's interesting. Sometimes, I have these headings in my Bible. Jesus, the first time, the second time, the third time predicts his death. It's really more than that. And here in verse 45, we have another time, much shorter, not as maybe clear as these others, but there he is talking about his death and what he is going to do for them. It's not, his life isn't spent trying to promote himself. It is spent for others completely. Anybody have any other comments up to this point?
Brad, I was just thinking about, were they thinking about the physical, still thinking of a physical kingdom, which was in the mind of, the so many at that time? Or were they, thinking in terms of the eternal kingdom?
We said earlier, it's hard to get in their minds, but I think on that question, it is very clear. They're still thinking physical here. They're thinking about it, the establishment of a physical kingdom. And we'll see after Jesus has been crucified, among the disciples, their hopes are dashed. They thought that Jesus was the Messiah, but now he must not have been, because he didn't do what we thought he was going to do. So I think the answer to your question is absolutely. They thought this was going to be a physical kingdom where Jesus was going to take the physical throne of David and reign over Israel. Nick, you started to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, when we think about Jesus, his being a servant, the suffering servant, he gave his life as a ransom, it says there in verse 45, for many. He gave his life for everybody in actuality, because Hebrews 2 says he tasted of death for every man so that our sins might be forgiven. But I guess what I'm thinking about here is that's an example of Jesus, who's the Son of God, giving his life in service to all of mankind. And James and John are two of his disciples that gave their lives. And one of them, of course, gave his life by dying as a martyr, which made his life shorter in that sense. But then John gave his life in commitment to serving the Lord for, as was pointed out, over a longer period of time. And what we've got to realize is, we ask ourselves, can we commit to giving our life for the Lord? And we ought to, because he gave his life for us. But that'll be the answer, because if more likely, if we're not willing to give our life for the Lord, where we would give up our physical life at any given time, even in the shortness of life, we're not likely to give our life to him if we lived a long time.
Yeah.
And those are two examples here in this context that we see is going to give their lives, yes. And
it's easier to be moved by a passage like this and decide, I'm going to go out today and I'm going to serve somebody. And we might do it for a few days, but it's not about a few days of service. Like you said, it's about giving our life to serve Christ. And what Christ wants us to do is serve all men. That's a great point. All right, well, I think we'll have time to go ahead and finish out chapter 10. So let's read 46 through 52. And let's see, Lisa must have got kicked out or dropped off. So we'll just start back with Miss Chris. Chris, then Aaron, then Ian, then Justin, then Nick, and just read one verse apiece here. And then
Starting with 43.
46.
Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road.
And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to the city out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.
Then many warned him to be quiet, but he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me.
Jesus stopped and said, call him here. So they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, stand up. He is calling for you.
And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus.
So Jesus answered and said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabboni, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. So just real quick, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but this is a passage that when you compare it to what Matthew and Luke say, this is one that's sometimes brought up about contradictions. Anybody know what the contradictions, the seeming contradictions are with this passage and what the other gospel accounts say? Well, Matthew will tell us that there were two blind men. In Matthew 20, it'll say there were two blind men. The other discrepancy is both Matthew and Mark say that as Jesus was going out of Jericho, that they met the blind man. In Luke's account, Luke will say that as he entered. And so just real quick, we can deal with both of those things. One thing about dispelling a possible contradiction, we don't have to be able to say this is what happened. What we have to do is offer a possible explanation. And as long as there is a possible explanation to how the varying accounts can be harmonized, then that proves there's no contradiction. And so does Mark or Luke, either one, say there wasn't a second blind man? You say there's only one blind man? No. And Mark, by calling this man by name, shows, he has an interest in this particular man. And some have concluded maybe he went on to be a close disciple and a friend and acquaintance, and that's why we don't know about that. But in retelling stories that we've seen or been a part of, we'll often do things like this. We won't give all the details about every person involved. We'll focus in on one. And so nothing that's said in Mark or in Luke excludes the possibility that there was another blind man there on that same occasion. As to Jericho, that one is pretty interesting to me. We won't spend a lot of time, but there was the ancient side of Jericho that we read about in the book of Joshua that was destroyed, but then Jericho was rebuilt. And it wasn't rebuilt in the exact same location. In fact, if you went over there today to Jericho, you would be from what I understand, a third location of Jericho. And what some have surmised is that both Matthew and Mark are speaking of one of the places, the new Jericho, and then Luke is, as he entered Jericho, talking about the ancient Jericho. And I may have that backwards, but that's an explanation that's given. Again, it doesn't have to be the exact explanation, but that would prove, that would be a possible explanation to show there's no contradiction. And I want to bring that up because, again, if somebody is going through this with us and they have that question and thinking, well, if we can't trust that, we can't trust anything. I think, again, we can trust it. They could have gotten together and got this story straight, but they told the story the way they intended to. And we can have every confidence that this is inspired by God. Now, to the actual events, as they're going along, here's the blind man, he's crying out. And what's the reaction of those with Jesus when they hear him crying out?
Told him to be quiet.
And be quiet. But this blind man who's crying out after Jesus, he shows that while a lot of the multitude who's continued with Jesus on this trip to Jerusalem, they don't still understand, who Jesus is, what he's going to do. This blind man shows he has some understanding. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. He recognized truly who Jesus is. He understands the power that Jesus has, and he understands what's needed in order to receive that power, and that's mercy. And so he requests that, and he's not deterred by the crowd. What if he had listened to the crowd and thought, well, I'll just wait, because he's made this trip a number of times. He'll come back again. Maybe the crowds won't be with him, and I'll have a better opportunity. What if that had happened?
He may have missed his opportunity.
He would have, because Jesus isn't coming this way again. And so he's not deterred by those who would have put him off. And that's something, as people are seeking Jesus today, looking for the mercy of Jesus, you're going to have a lot of people in your ear. We'll have a lot of people in our ears trying to distract us and pull us away and keep us from going to Christ. Don't let them. It's too important for us to receive that mercy. Now, when he's asking for mercy here, what's he asking for? Because Jesus will say, what do you want me to do for you? And what is his request?
To regain his sight.
I want my sight. Anybody think that's an odd question that Jesus asks?
Well, that this is one of my favorite passages. The man physically, from what I'm reading here, could not see, but really the man could see. He could see what the other people could not see. He could see, something about Jesus that was going to not only be for his physical sight, but it was going to be forever.
Yes,
to
ma'am.
him.
That's what you make a good point there, that he has a lot of sight that others around don't have. And so when he's asked, what do you want? That's what he's asking. I'd like to have my sight. He's
Also begging, and that would be a natural question to ask, to a beggar is, what can I do for you? What
Yeah.
would you have me do? And of course, the man picks out the thing that's going to solve possibly his begging. If he gets his sight, he's an able-bodied man, he's going to be back working, But I think the good point is he did not let other people decide. Once I think as has been pointed out, he knew who Jesus was and the lineage. He's a son of David, and those were important things. And those are important factors that the Bible reveals to us so that we know who Jesus is, that he is that promised Messiah, and he's recognizing that.
Yeah. And anybody else that
important.
would have come by, who would have approached this man and said, what would you have me do for him? The answer would have been, give me some money, give me some food, give me something that will help me. But that's not what he asked Jesus for, because he knows Jesus can give him more. And I think about the lame man in Acts chapter 3, who's looking for money, and Peter and John come in and say, we don't have that, but we've got something better for you. Rise up. And a lot of people come to religion looking for the physical things, to help us have a better life here. Jesus has something that we need much more, and he's the only one that can give it to us. And so let's take advantage of the blessings only he can give, and not settle for the temporary things of this life. So I think that's a great point you made there, Nick, and a good place for us to end. I'll just say one more thing about verse 52. How was this healing accomplished? Did he give them some glasses?
Immediately.
It's immediately. Again, if people talk about miracles today, but if there are miracles today, then they're going to look like the miracles of the Bible. And the miracles of the Bible were immediate, they were complete. And so if we start seeing things like that, then maybe I'll be convinced that there's something going on here, but we just don't see those things. Well,
And
we're out of
Red,
time. Yes, ma'am.
he began following Jesus at that point also.
Yes, ma'am. That's right. He followed Jesus. Well, I appreciate you girls being with us today. We're out of time, so we'll go ahead and stop for now. And we'll pick up in chapter 11. And Kyle, he had to miss today, and he was supposed to do this, so he said he would pick up next week. So we'll look forward to that. Till then, you all stay safe and keep reading.
Thank you.